So, chess is pretty cool, but recently I was wondering what it would look like in an RPG form, and since I happen to know how to develop games, I set it to do just that. In roughly 3 months, or 100 days for that sweet clickable YouTube thumbnail. What do I mean when I say a chess RPG? In my head, RPGs typically have a level up system. So the first thing I did when planning out this game was I drafted up a leveling system, but the more I thought about it, the more that leveling system became too big and would require too long of a game for me to reasonably complete in 3 months. So I scrapped it in favor of traditional chess movement, which would be easier for me to implement and easier for the player to understand regardless. At this point, I also decided that the game would be exactly 10 levels long. This was primarily to keep the scope in check. If I compromised on this later, that would mean I'd have to adjust so many other things. So having a set number of levels that I'm going to be working with really keeps my focus on the levels themselves. We know that the units on the board are going to be moving like traditional chess pieces, but what does the gameplay loop itself look like? I decided on 2 level types. One level type focuses on getting your king to the other side of the board. This is similar to pawn promotion. The other type is kill your opponent's king, or alternatively, you kill your opponent's leader. Since this isn't just chess, I can make the opponent's leader not a king. Now, for the levels themselves, I could give the player an entire chessboard's worth of pieces, but I had 2 problems with that. One, that would be hard for a player to suddenly adjust to, especially if they're not particularly into chess. 2, that would make designing levels significantly harder. So instead of that, I decided the player would get 5 pieces. Their king, which functions as a king, a knight, a rook, a bishop, and a pawn, which can promote into a queen. This small team is used for every single level, and while on the early levels it's more than sufficient, you'll have to take on tougher and tougher enemies without getting any power-ups yourself, making it a strongly skill-based game. The one other thing this game has that's like an RPG is a story, which I figured would be easy enough to implement, so I decided early in development that I'd come back to it later in development. But the rudimentary story I came up with from the start was, a witch burns down your village, you are out to kill her. I stuck to that story just for the sake of simplicity. I could always modify the details later, if absolutely necessary. Now, since this is a video game, I needed graphics, which means choosing an art style. Shortly before starting the project, I had played through Shovel Knight, and it got me really into retro game aesthetics, primarily NES games. So I set up a simple but loose palette to which I could add a few colors if absolutely necessary, and I sketched up a map. This map also served as how you would go between different levels. When sharing screenshots of this to some people, one of them pointed out that they were wondering how the game would look on a CRT. I, also curious, decided to throw on a CRT filter, and I absolutely loved it. So the CRT filter stuck around. I decided I'd keep it as the primary art style for the game, developing the rest of the art with a CRT in mind. This primarily means that the blending between pixels and scan lines had to be accounted for, and in some cases, utilized to my advantage. Now I had the basic gameplay loop and an art style, which meant it was time to start developing the levels. My level making process is incredibly sophisticated. I have a vague idea of what kind of level it's going to be, and I know how difficult it needs to be relative to the other levels. So I splash some tiles on the level, and then I place some random pieces on the board. Then I playtest the level until it starts feeling fun to play. After the level itself was done, then it was time to decorate it. I did this through 2 methods. I would 1. Add some foliage to the side through procedural generation, and 2. Add the dithering effect just to add some detail to the scene. At this point, I would hand the game off to my playtesters and get their feedback on the levels. Playtesting here was actually super important, because the playtesters noticed a lot of small things I never would have personally. After making a few levels, I had to come back to the story, which now had to be conveyed to the player. For some reason, my stupid ass thought it would be easier and more fun to make cutscenes to express the story than to just use dialogue. Which meant I had to hand draw a bunch of animations, which easily added 3 weeks of development time onto the project. And this was my first project where I was really heavily using Sprite as my primary pixel art tool, which meant a lot of learning, a lot of mistakes, and a lot of having to redo entire cutscenes. So yeah, that took forever. And, to make things worse, I still hadn't gotten around to the music. Mostly because I don't know how to make music. At all. I tried, I really did try, and I came up with 2 tracks, one of which I ended up really hating and throwing away, and the other one ended up in the final game. But 1 track is not enough for an entire game. So, I went with the only solution that wouldn't take several months. I AI generated the music. Some people don't like AI generated content for their games and movies and such. I understand, I don't like using it either, but I really didn't have a choice. I can't do music, and I didn't just want to leave the game without music, and I also didn't want to spend the next 5 months learning music just to add it to this one game. So I decided on the compromise of using AI music for this project. In between projects, I've been learning more about music theory and how to make my own music for my next games. But yeah, AI generated music for this game. If you're opposed to that, you can mute it. With that, there was just a few odds and ends to tie up the game. There was 2 big playtesting sessions, one at the beginning of the development and one near the end, And I had one playtester play at least once every week or two during development. This helped me iron out a lot of small flaws. Things like a lack of a restart button, or a small discrepancy on where you can move on a level not being visible. Small stuff like that was easily patched between bigger things to do. Then, once the game was about done, I gave it a name finally. That's right, this game was just called RPG Chess throughout its entire development. In fact, when I talk about it to my friends, I still call it the chess game. But I came up with a name, Ashes and Dots, ashes referring to how your village is burned down, and dots referring to this dithering effect which kinda looks like dots on a CRT. Not a great name, but I'm not good at naming things. If anyone comes up with a better name, feel free to suggest it to me. I'm totally willing to change the name of this game later. Anyway, now with a name, the game had been finished. You can play Ashes and Dots right now, for free, on itch.io in browser. I might add a download later too, we'll see. Now, the remaining lingering question is, what's next? Am I going to add more content to Ashes and Dots? Maybe. If people like the game, I'll definitely come back to it. I have a bunch of things that I scrapped during development, primarily a hard mode, an achievement system, and a level editor. They were all scrapped for the sake of scope. I didn't want to over-encumber myself with a huge to-do list of things. But if people really like the game, I can totally come back and do these things. But if people don't like the game, that's fine. I'll just move on to other projects. I have a bunch of ideas swirling around for what game I'm going to make next, and I'll probably decide on one in the next week or two. I'm not going to upload here when I make that decision, primarily because I only really want to post here when there's a big update, something like a playable demo or a full game release. But if you want to see more of my game development process and the small decisions I make along the way, then you can come join me on my Discord server, which is in the description. And that's all I have to say, so, bye!